Hello class, welcome to our lesson today dealing with solving inequalities, but today we're looking at multiplication and division as opposed to adding and subtracting. Most of what we're looking at is the same. There's one piece that we're going to talk about in the second half of the lesson that you need to add to your repertoire in order to be successful in this section, but overall it's the same as what we did with equations in chapter 3. If you see n over 3, that's divide by 3. The opposite of division is multiplication. So you multiply both sides by 3, you get n is less than 3. Remember, you want 3 numbers on your number line at least. Open circle going to the left. 4x greater than or equal to negative 16. To get rid of the 4 in front of the x, that's multiplication, so you have to do division of 4 on both sides. X greater than or equal to negative 4. Notice the order of my numbers with the negatives. Remember, it's negative 5, then negative 4, negative 3 from least to greatest. You want to make sure you're paying attention to that as you solve your your inequalities. Next one, you divide by 4 on both sides. B is less than half. You could also say 0.5. Notice on this one I went by 0.5s to graph on my number line. Next one, divide by 12, Negative 24 divided by 12 is a negative 2. Just be careful about your negative sign. Close circle because it has the equal to, and then going to the left. The fractions and decimals that many of you have been struggling with in chapter 3 should be a little bit easier now that you've dealt with them before. So this 1/2 or 0.5 out front, just divide by 0.5 on both sides. Negative 2 divided by a half is actually negative 4. It's a greater than, so it's an open circle and going to the right. The next one is 2/3 p. Notice I flipped it around so the variable's on the left side. To get rid of a fraction coefficient, you always multiply by its reciprocal. Okay, so that's something you want to keep track of as you're looking at these questions. And when you multiply by the reciprocal, you get p is less than negative 6. So open circle, at negative 6, and then you go to the left because it's a less than question. Okay, here's where the main difference about multiplication and division you have to make sure is figured out. These two questions look very similar. Okay, notice that there's a negative sign on the 12 on this first one, and the negative signs on the 2 on the second one. So to get x by itself, you divide by the coefficient. So for this first one, I divide by 2 on both sides. I get x less than negative 6, so open circle, then to the left. The second one, I'm going to divide by negative 2, okay, because the coefficient here is negative. I still get negative 6 as an answer, but this one is where you flip the sign. You're going to hear a lot of teachers say that as you work through your classes. And here's the reasoning. If you thought that it was a less than still, let's take a big negative number, negative 10. And if I take negative 2 times negative 10, I'm going to get negative 20. Positive 20, not negative 20. Okay, a lot of students will say, oh, it's just negative, so it just stays negative. But a negative times another negative will end up being positive. And this doesn't end up working because 20 is greater than 12, and you need it to be less than 12. So the only way to make that work is to pick a x value that is actually larger, okay, as a positive or a smaller, okay, or closer to 0 negative. So if I would have plugged in 100, negative 2 times 100 would be negative 200. That would work. Okay, so what we're saying here is when we multiply or divide by a negative, we're going to flip the sign. Notice that did not happen here on this first one because I did not divide by a negative. It doesn't matter what the starting number is. It's the coefficient that ends up mattering. So the new part to the note should be anytime you multiply or divide by a negative, it flips the sign. And the logic is a negative times a negative or divided by a negative actually does its opposite idea because it goes to the other side of the number line. Okay, other than that, everything's the same. So for this one, divide by negative 3, I flip the sign. So now it's really a less than question. This next one here, negative x over 2, you could think of this as dividing by a negative 2. This negative sign can go into either aspect of the question, the numerator or the denominator. So if you put it with the denominator, you're just going to multiply both sides by negative 2. But notice I went from a less than to a greater than symbol. And so I have a filled in circle at 32, but going to the right instead of the left. Next one, same thing. It's a fraction coefficient, but it's negative. You still multiply by the reciprocal. That would be negative 5 over 2. Multiply both sides by that. I get a positive 20, but it's greater than or equal to because it has to be larger positive numbers to make an even smaller negative answer. The next one is kind of tricky. My suggestion is still flip it around so that you have the variable on the left side. So you flip it around and say, all right, negative 2.5q greater than negative 15. You divide by negative 2.5 on both sides, which flipped the sign. You say, well, Mr. Rendell, why did I even flip it then? Look, the symbol's the same as what it started with. Well, the symbol's the same, but the variable is on the other side. Because if you leave this the same, you're actually saying Q is greater than, if you read it kind of from backwards, the Q is greater than the other number, when you really want Q to be less than. So when you're dealing with these scenarios, you want to make sure that you look at it from the perspective of which variable should I be dealing with, how can I isolate it, and then should I flip the sign because the coefficient is negative. All right, so make sure you show your step. The only thing that we just talked about, multiply or divide by a negative, you flip the sign. So it's the same, graph the inequality, show your step, solve the inequality. But that's the wrinkle. You got to make sure when you multiply or divide by a negative that you flip the sign. Have a good day, everyone.